Karen insisted my road was public, so I started charging toll fees. You know what they say about good fences making good neighbors? Well, in my case, it wasn't about fences. It was about a private road that had been in my family for 3 generations. I never thought I'd have to defend my property rights against an entitled neighbor who decided my driveway was her personal shortcut, but here we are. This is the story of how one Karen's insistence that my private road was public property led me to become the most creative toll booth operator in Riverside Township. Life on Maple Ridge Road had always been peaceful. My grandfather built this winding quarter-mile stretch of private road back in 1952, when this area was nothing but farmland. He wanted a scenic approach to the Victorian house he'd built on the hillside, something that would showcase the beautiful pine trees and natural rock formations that made this property special. I'm James Mitchell, Jim to my friends, and I've lived here my entire life. I watched as Riverside Township grew around us, transforming from rural countryside into suburban sprawl. Our private road remained a quiet sanctuary, maintained solely by my family. We never minded the occasional lost driver who would turn around in our circular driveway, or the rare neighbor who would ask permission to use our road during heavy snowfalls when the main street, Oakwood, became too treacherous. My wife Linda and I took pride in maintaining Maple Ridge Road, just as my father and grandfather had done. Every spring we'd repair any winter damage, trim back the trees, and ensure the drainage systems were clear. It wasn't cheap. Last year alone, we spent over $12,000 on resurfacing and installing new culverts. But it was worth it. This road was part of our heritage. The trouble began when the new Pine Grove community development broke ground on the other side of our property. The developers had initially approached me about buying a portion of our land for a connecting road, but I declined. Our private road was special. It wasn't meant to be a thoroughfare for an entire subdivision. Everything changed the day Karen Thompson moved into the largest house in Pine Grove community. From her back deck, she could see our pristine, tree-lined road, a much more scenic route to the shopping center than the congested Oakwood street she was supposed to use. At first, it was just her silver SUV occasionally cutting through. I didn't make a fuss. One car wouldn't hurt. But Karen Thompson wasn't content with just using our road. She had to share her discovery with everyone she knew. One morning, as I sipped my coffee on the front porch, I counted 17 cars in 30 minutes using our private road as a shortcut. The peaceful sanctuary my grandfather had created was turning into a rush hour bypass. When I installed a private road, no public access sign, Karen started a neighborhood Facebook group claiming I was trying to restrict access to a public road. I tried to be reasonable. I really did. When Karen marched up to my door that Saturday morning, her designer handbag swinging with self-righteous energy, I calmly explained the history of our road and showed her the property documents. But she wasn't interested in facts. "This is a public road, Mr. Mitchell," she declared, her voice dripping with condescension. "You can't just claim a road as private because you've lived here a long time. I've already contacted the township about this. You'll be hearing from them soon." As I watched her storm back to her SUV, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. The entitled look in her eyes, the way she'd dismissed decades of property records with a wave of her manicured hand, this was someone who was used to getting her way. Little did Karen know, she'd just awakened something. In me, if she wanted to insist this was a public road, well, public roads often have toll fees, don't they? I smiled as an idea began to form. Two could play at this game, and I had 3 generations of Mitchell stubbornness backing me up. That evening, as Linda and I discussed the situation over dinner, our longtime neighbor Mike Anderson dropped by. He'd lived next door for 20 years and had always respected our private road policies. "Jim, you won't believe what I just saw," Mike said. shaking his head. "That Thompson woman is going door to door in Pine Grove, telling everyone this is a public access road. She's even started a petition to force you to remove your sign." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling surprisingly calm. "Well, Mike, I think it's time we showed Karen exactly what happens when you mistake private property for public domain." After my conversation with Mike Anderson, I knew I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. Karen Thompson wasn't just any entitled neighbor. She was a force of nature wrapped in designer clothes and armed with a smartphone. The very next morning, I discovered just how far she'd already pushed her agenda. My phone buzzed with messages from various neighbors sharing screenshots of Karen's latest social media crusade. She had created a Facebook group called Open Maple Ridge Road that had already gathered over 200 members. Her post, complete with dramatic photos of our private road sign, painted a picture of oppression and elitism that would have made any propaganda minister proud. "Attention, Pine Grove community," her post declared. "One selfish resident is blocking our access to a vital connecting road, forcing us to waste time and gas on unnecessary detours. This is public infrastructure, and we demand access. Sign our petition to have the township declare Maple Ridge Road public property." I'll admit, seeing those blatant lies about my family's private property made my blood boil. But years of managing construction projects had taught me the value of staying cool under pressure. Instead of firing back online, I decided to do what Karen hadn't bothered with: actual research. My first stop was the township records office. The elderly clerk, Martha, had worked there since I was a kid, and her face lit up with recognition as I walked in. "Jim Mitchell, haven't seen you in here since your father transferred the property deed. What brings you by?" I explained the situation, and Martha's friendly smile turned serious. "Oh dear, I knew this might happen when they approved that new development. Give me a few minutes. I'll pull everything we have on Maple Ridge Road." What Martha brought out was a treasure trove of documentation. The original survey maps from 1952 showed my grandfather's property boundaries and the private road he'd constructed. There were permits, maintenance records, and most importantly, a clear designation of Maple Ridge Road as a private thoroughfare, never dedicated to public use. But the most interesting document was from just 2 years ago: the approved plans for Pine Grove community. The developers had clearly marked our road as private property and had designed their street layout accordingly. Karen's claims about it being vital infrastructure were completely fabricated. Armed with copies of everything, I made my next stop at the office of Jennifer Parker, a property rights attorney recommended by Mike Anderson. Jennifer's office was modest but professional, and she listened intently as I laid out the situation. "Well, Mr. Mitchell," she said, reviewing the documents, "your position is legally solid. Private road rights are well established in this state, but..." She paused, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "Social pressure can sometimes be more challenging than legal issues. Have you considered how to handle the community backlash?" I smiled, sharing my idea about the toll booth. Jennifer's eyes widened, then she broke into a grin. "Actually, that's brilliant. As a private road owner, you have every right to restrict access or charge for usage. Just make sure everything is properly documented and posted." But before I could implement my plan, Karen escalated things further. That afternoon, I returned home to find a township enforcement officer in my driveway. Officer David Brown looked uncomfortable as he explained that they'd received multiple complaints about illegal road restrictions. I invited Officer Brown inside and showed him all the documentation I'd gathered. His relief was visible as he realized this wasn't going to be the confrontation Karen had probably hoped for. "Mr. Mitchell, your paperwork is in order," he said. "But I should warn you, Mrs. Thompson seems very determined. She's already scheduled to speak at next week's township meeting about this." Perfect. If Karen wanted to make this a public Spectacle. I'd be ready. Over the next few days, I prepared meticulously. I had copies of all relevant documents professionally bound. I researched similar cases where private road owners had successfully defended their rights. And most importantly, I worked on my toll booth plan. My brother-in-law, a contractor, helped me design something that would make a statement, not just a simple barrier, but a professional-looking booth complete with a mechanical arm, security cameras, and a credit card reader. We worked through the weekend, and by Sunday night everything was ready. Monday morning, I waited. The usual parade of shortcut-taking cars began around 7:30 a.m. The first few drivers stopped in confusion at the new booth, reading the professionally printed sign, Private Road Access, Daily Pass, 25 monthly pass, $300, credit cards accepted. Then right on schedule, a familiar silver SUV came roaring up. Karen's face was a study in disbelief as she screeched to a halt in front of the booth. I stepped out, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and my most professional smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Will you be purchasing a daily or monthly pass today?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The sound that came from Karen's throat was somewhere between a gasp and a shriek. "You can't do this. This is a public road." "Actually," I replied calmly, holding up my tablet, "as these property records clearly show, this is a private road. And since you've been so insistent about using it, I've decided to make it accessible, for a reasonable fee, of course." Karen's face turned an impressive shade of red. She fumbled for her phone, presumably to document this latest outrage for her Facebook group. "This is extortion. I'm calling the police." "Please do," I said cheerfully. "Officer Brown is already familiar with the situation. But in the meantime, you'll need to either pay the toll or use Oakwood Street like everyone else." With a screech of tires, Karen reversed and sped away, leaving a trail of gravel and indignation. Through the morning, I watched as her regular parade of shortcut seekers encountered the booth. Some laughed and turned around. A few actually paid the toll, deciding their time was worth the cost. By lunchtime, Karen's Facebook group was on fire with accusations and threats. But mixed in with the outrage were some interesting comments from longtime residents who remembered my grandfather and understood why we'd want to protect our private road. The battle lines were drawn, and I had made my position clear. If Karen wanted to turn this into a crusade, she'd learn that some property owners know how to stand their ground and charge admission for the show. The township meeting that Thursday evening was packed. Word had spread about the toll booth controversy, and it seemed like half of Pine Grove community had shown up to voice their opinions. I sat quietly in the back, watching as Karen Thompson strode to the podium during the public comment section, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor with determined precision. "Members of the council," she began, her voice quivering with rehearsed emotion, "I stand before you today on behalf of hundreds of concerned citizens. James Mitchell has erected an illegal toll booth on what is clearly a public access road. He's charging extortionate fees and preventing hardworking residents from using the most efficient route to their homes." I noticed Robert Wilson, the council chairman, trying to maintain his neutral expression as Karen continued her performance. She'd brought visual aids, photos of my toll booth, screenshots of supposed complaints, and even a poorly researched presentation about historical public access rights. "This road has been used by residents for years," she declared, conveniently ignoring that those users had always asked permission first. "Mr. Mitchell is attempting to privatize public infrastructure for his own profit. We demand immediate action to remove this illegal obstruction and fine him for his audacious behavior." When Karen finally finished her 20-minute speech, Robert Wilson cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to respond?" I walked to the podium calmly, carrying my own folder of documents. The room was silent, anticipating another heated speech. Instead, I smiled and began quietly. Chairman Wilson, council members, I'll be brief. First, I'd like to submit these documents for the record. I handed over the property records, surveys, and maintenance receipts I'd gathered. Maple Ridge Road was built by my grandfather in 1952 as a private access road. It has never been dedicated to public use. My family has maintained it exclusively at our own expense for over 70 years. I pulled out last year's maintenance receipts. In the past 12 months alone, I've spent over $12,000 on road maintenance. Mrs. Thompson's social media campaign has resulted in hundreds of unauthorized vehicles using my private road daily, causing significant wear and tear. The toll booth is a legitimate response to this unauthorized use. Karen tried to interrupt, but Chairman Wilson silenced her with a raised hand. I continued. I've also brought statements from long-time residents who can attest to the road's private status, including Mike Anderson, who's lived next door for 20 years. Additionally, I have the approved plans for Pine Grove community, which clearly mark Maple Ridge Road as private property. The council members passed around my documentation, their expressions thoughtful. Mark Edwards, the city planner, spoke up. Mr. Mitchell is correct. The development plans for Pine Grove community explicitly acknowledged Maple Ridge Road as private property. The approved traffic flow patterns were designed around using Oakwood Street as the main access point. Karen's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. I wasn't done yet. Furthermore, I added, retrieving one final document, I have here a copy of a letter sent to Mrs. Thompson by the developers 2 years ago, specifically informing all potential buyers that Maple Ridge Road was private property and not available for general use. She signed this acknowledgement when purchasing her home. The room erupted in whispers. Karen's carefully crafted narrative was unraveling, but I had one more point to make. I don't actually want to charge tolls, I said quietly. I simply want to protect my property rights and maintain the road's historic character. I'm happy to discuss reasonable limited access agreements with immediate neighbors for emergency situations, but I cannot and will not allow my private road to become a public thoroughfare. Robert Wilson nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Mrs. Thompson, would you like to respond to these documents? Karen rushed back to the podium, but her confidence was visibly shaken. This is absurd. Times change. The community needs this access. You can't let one person's selfish interests override the needs of hundreds. Actually, Jennifer Parker spoke up from her seat. That's exactly how private property rights work, Mrs. Thompson. The township has no authority to force Mr. Mitchell to allow public access to his private road. The council deliberated briefly before Chairman Wilson delivered their decision. Based on the documentation provided, it's clear that Maple Ridge Road is privately owned and maintained by Mr. Mitchell. The township has no jurisdiction to interfere with his legitimate property rights. Mrs. Thompson, your petition is denied. The meeting wasn't over, but the crucial battle had been won. As Karen stormed out, followed by her disappointed supporters, several council members approached to examine my documentation more closely. Robert Wilson pulled me aside. Jim, you handled that very professionally, he said quietly. But this might not be the end of it. People like Mrs. Thompson don't give up easily. I nodded, watching as Jennifer Parker gathered our documents. I know. That's why the cameras I installed at the toll booth record 24/7, and why I've documented every social media post, every trespassing incident, and every attempt to undermine my property rights. Walking out of the township building that evening, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The legal battle had been won, but I suspected Karen Thompson wasn't finished yet. She'd invested too much of her ego in this crusade to back down gracefully. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find my toll booth had been vandalized overnight. The security cameras had caught everything, including Karen's silver SUV parked nearby, while two men attacked the booth with spray paint and baseball bats. I called Officer Brown immediately. The game had changed. What started as a property dispute had escalated into criminal vandalism. As I watched the police dust the damaged booth for fingerprints, I realized this wasn't just about a private road anymore. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted through intimidation and force. Little did Karen know, she'd just given me exactly what I needed to end this once and for all. Sometimes, the best way to deal with entitled behavior is to let it self-destruct spectacularly, and Karen Thompson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The security camera footage was crystal clear, showing every detail of the toll booth vandalism. Officer Brown watched it in my living room, his expression growing increasingly serious as the scene unfolded. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. 2 men in hoodies methodically destroying the booth, while Karen Thompson's distinctive silver SUV idled nearby, its headlights illuminating their work. "This is pretty damning evidence, Mr. Mitchell," Officer Brown said, pausing the footage. "We can clearly identify Mrs. Thompson's vehicle, and the camera caught her license plate when she drove away. Do you want to press charges?" I leaned back, in my chair, considering my options. "Yes, but first I need to gather more information. Something about this feels too organized to be a simple vandalism case." That afternoon, I met with Jennifer Parker at her office, bringing copies of all the evidence I'd collected. Together, we spread everything across her conference table: the security footage, Karen's social media posts, the township meeting records, and dozens of documented trespassing incidents. "Look at this pattern," Jennifer said, pointing to a series of Facebook messages in Karen's group. "She's been systematically building up to this. First, she tried the legal route through the township. When that failed, she moved to social pressure, and now she's escalated to property destruction." But it was what Jennifer found next that really caught my attention. Buried in the comments of Karen's Facebook group was a revealing exchange between her and the two vandals. They weren't random thugs. They were contractors working on the Pine Grove community development, and their messages suggested this wasn't just about road access. "Jim," Jennifer said, her voice serious, "I think we've uncovered something bigger. Here, these contractors mentioned phase 2 of the development. Have you heard anything about expansion plans?" I hadn't, but a quick search of public records revealed something interesting. Pine Grove Community's developers had quietly purchased several parcels of land adjacent to my property. Their Phase 2 plans, still pending approval, showed a proposed connecting road running right through where my private road currently existed. "They're trying to force you out," Jennifer concluded. "Karen isn't just an angry neighbor. She's working with the developers. They probably promised her something in return for leading this campaign against you." The pieces started falling into place. Karen's sudden move to Pine Grove, her immediate focus on my road, the coordinated social media campaign. It wasn't random at all. They'd selected her specifically for this role, counting on her aggressive personality to wear me down. I spent the next few days diving deeper into research. Sarah Williams, a local real estate agent and friend of Linda's, provided valuable insider information about Pine Grove's development plans. The proposed Phase 2 would double the size of the community, but it all hinged on acquiring a connecting road, my road. "They've been trying to buy up all the surrounding properties," Sarah explained over coffee. "Your road is the last piece they need. Without it, their expansion plans are stuck. They'd have to build a new access road, which would cost millions and require extensive environmental impact studies." Armed with this knowledge, I decided to take action on multiple fronts. First, I filed a police report about the vandalism, providing all the evidence, including the security footage and social media exchanges. Officer Brown took the case seriously, especially given the connection to the development company. Next, I had Jennifer draft a cease and desist letter to both Karen and the development company, outlining their coordinated harassment campaign and threatening legal action for damages. We included copies of all the evidence we'd gathered, making it clear that we knew about their Phase 2 plans, but I didn't stop there. Working with the traffic engineer John Peterson, I documented every instance of unauthorized road use and property damage since Karen began her campaign. John's report was thorough, estimating thousands of dollars in accelerated wear and tear to the road surface. This level of traffic isn't just damaging your road, John explained, showing me detailed analyses. It's also creating safety issues. Your private road wasn't designed for this volume of vehicles. The curves, drainage, and sightlines were all engineered for limited residential use. I also discovered something interesting about Karen's property purchase. Through careful document review, we found that she'd bought her house at a significant discount, with several unusual contract clauses buried in the fine print. One clause specifically mentioned cooperation in community expansion efforts. The investigation had revealed a complex web of deception. Karen wasn't just an entitled neighbor, she was a pawn in a larger scheme. The developers had planted her there, using her aggressive personality as a weapon in their attempt to force me into selling. But their plan had backfired spectacularly. Instead of wearing me down, their tactics had only made me more determined to protect my property rights. And now, with evidence of their coordinated harassment campaign, we had leverage they never expected. I called an emergency meeting with my legal team to plan our next move. Jennifer brought in a real estate attorney specializing in development disputes. Over several hours, we mapped out a strategy that would not only protect my property, but expose the developers' underhanded tactics. They thought they could bully you into submission, Jennifer said, organizing our evidence into clear categories. Instead, they've given us everything we need to file a major lawsuit. We're talking harassment, conspiracy, property damage, and potentially even fraud, given those hidden contract clauses with Mrs. Thompson. The developers had played a clever game, but they'd made one crucial mistake. By choosing Karen as their agent and encouraging her aggressive tactics, they'd created a clear paper trail of their intentions. Every social media post, every confrontation, every act of vandalism strengthened our case. I sat in Jennifer's office reviewing our strategy one final time. The toll booth incident had been just the beginning. Karen and her developers had unknowingly walked right into a legal trap of their own making. Sometimes, the best way to fight back against bullies is to let them think they're winning, right until the moment their whole scheme comes crashing down. With our evidence mounting, it was time to build a stronger coalition. Linda suggested we hold a community meeting to share what we'd discovered. We decided to host it at Mike Anderson's house to avoid any potential confrontations on our property. The turnout surprised even me. 30 longtime residents showed up, including several from Pine Grove community who had grown suspicious of Karen's aggressive campaign. Emily Cooper, a professional mediator who lived on Oakwood Street, moderated the meeting. Her calm presence helped keep emotions in check as I presented our findings. When I revealed the developers' Phase 2 plans and Karen's connection to them, the room erupted with concerned murmurs. "So, this was never about road access," said Steve Davis, who'd initially supported Karen's petition but now looked troubled. "And they're using us to pressure you into selling. That's why Karen kept pushing everyone to use your road. They wanted to create a traffic problem." Maria Ramirez, an elderly resident who'd lived in the area even longer than my family, stood up shakily. "My late husband worked with your grandfather when he built that road," she said, her voice firm despite her age. He always said good neighbors respect property lines. What these developers are doing, it's shameful. The meeting lasted for hours as more residents shared their own experiences. Several Pine Grove homeowners revealed that they'd been pressured by Karen to use my road and join her Facebook campaign. Others mentioned unusual clauses in their purchase contracts similar to Karen's. Tom Henderson, a retired civil engineer, offered another valuable perspective. "I've reviewed the township's infrastructure plans," he said, spreading out several maps on Mike's dining room table. "If Pine Grove expands as planned, the increased traffic would overwhelm not just Mr. Mitchell's road, but all the surrounding streets. They're trying to avoid paying for proper infrastructure by stealing private property." The community's support was growing, but we needed more than just moral backing. Jennifer Parker, who attended the meeting, suggested forming a formal neighborhood association, not to enforce rules like a homeowners association, but to protect residents' property rights against aggressive development. "What's happening to Jim could happen to any of you," Jennifer explained. "These developers aren't just after his road. They're setting a dangerous precedent for how private property rights can be undermined through social pressure and harassment." Mark Wilson, a local business owner, raised his hand. "I've dealt with these developers before," he said grimly. "They tried similar tactics in the commercial district last year. They plant someone like Karen to create problems, then swoop in, claiming they can solve everything if property owners just sell to them." The meeting took an unexpected turn when Susan Taylor, a local news reporter who'd been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore," she said. "It's a story about property rights, development ethics, and community manipulation. Would you be willing to go on record, Mr. Mitchell?" I glanced at Jennifer, who nodded subtly. Going public could help pressure the developers, but we needed to be strategic about it. "I'll share what we've discovered," I agreed. "But first, I'd like to gather statements from everyone here who's willing to speak about their experiences." The response was immediate. One by one, residents came forward to document their encounters with Karen and the developers. Emily Cooper helped organize the testimonies, creating a clear timeline of events. The pattern was undeniable: a systematic campaign to undermine private property rights through social manipulation and intimidation. Linda had been quietly observing, but now she stepped forward with an idea. "We should document the road's history," she suggested. "Maria, would you share your memories of when it was built? And Mike, you have those old photographs from when your family first moved here, right?" The suggestions sparked enthusiasm. Longtime residents began sharing stories and old pictures, creating a rich historical record of the neighborhood before. Pine Grove's development. Sarah Williams, the real estate agent, offered to research property values and development patterns to show how the community had evolved organically before the developers arrived. As the meeting wound down, we had accomplished more than I'd hoped. We'd formed a neighborhood advocacy group, gathered valuable testimonies, and created a strong network of support. But more importantly, we'd transformed isolated complaints into a unified community response. Dave Chen, a quiet software engineer who rarely spoke at community meetings, approached me as people were leaving. "They probably thought you'd be an easy target," he said thoughtfully. "One homeowner against a big development company. But they didn't count on the community coming together like this." He was right. The developers had miscalculated badly. By choosing such an aggressive approach through Karen, they'd not only exposed their tactics, but had united the community against them. Now, instead of facing a single determined homeowner, they were confronting an organized group of residents ready to protect their neighborhood's character. Jennifer stayed behind after others left, helping us organize the evening's documentation. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, reviewing the signed statements. "Individual testimony is powerful, but showing a pattern of behavior across The entire community strengthens our case significantly. Mike Anderson walked us to our car, shaking his head in amazement. You know, Jim, when you first installed that toll booth, I thought you were just being stubborn, but you've exposed something much bigger. These developers aren't just after your road. They're trying to change the whole character of our neighborhood. As Linda and I drove home that night, we passed Karen's house. The lights were on, and I could see her pacing inside, probably planning her next move. She had no idea that her aggressive tactics had backfired so completely, uniting the very community she'd tried to turn against me. Tomorrow, we would begin the next phase of our response. With the community's support and growing evidence of the developers' schemes, we were ready to take this fight to a larger stage. Karen and her developers had wanted a war over a private road. They were about to get one they never expected. The morning after our community meeting, I met with Jennifer Parker at her law office to develop our comprehensive legal strategy. Her conference room walls were covered with documents, photographs, and a detailed timeline of events we'd constructed. What had started as a simple property dispute had evolved into something much more complex. We need to approach this on multiple fronts, Jennifer said, tapping her pen against a legal pad. The vandalism case is straightforward criminal charges, but the civil case needs to address the broader conspiracy. We're not just dealing with Karen's harassment. We're looking at a coordinated effort to devalue and seize private property. Jennifer had brought in Catherine Martinez, a specialist in real estate development law, to help build our case. Catherine's experience with similar cases proved invaluable as she reviewed our evidence. This is actually a common tactic among aggressive developers, Catherine explained, spreading out several case files. They create artificial problems in target neighborhoods, then present themselves as the solution. But I've never seen such clear documentation of their methods before. Your security cameras and Karen's social media crusade give us a perfect paper trail. While the attorneys worked on our legal strategy, I had another meeting scheduled. Sarah Williams, our real estate agent ally, had arranged for me to speak with James Peterson, a former employee of the development company who'd left under controversial circumstances. We met at a quiet coffee shop 2 towns over to ensure privacy. What they're doing to you? It's their standard playbook, Peterson revealed, nervously glancing around. They identify strategic properties, plant problematic residents nearby, and create artificial crises. Karen Thompson isn't just a difficult neighbor. She's what we called a community disruptor. They probably gave her significant incentives to create problems. Peterson's testimony was crucial. He provided internal documents showing the company's strategy for acquiring properties through social pressure and manufactured conflicts. The documents even included profiles of potential disruptors, residents chosen specifically for their confrontational personalities and willingness to create neighborhood disputes. Back at Jennifer's office, we integrated Peterson's evidence into our case. Catherine was particularly interested in the internal documents. This proves premeditation, she said, highlighting key passages. They didn't just take advantage of a neighborhood dispute, they deliberately created one. That changes the entire scope of our lawsuit. Jennifer began drafting our initial court filing. We're not just suing for damages anymore, she explained. We're going after them for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of property rights. The vandalism incident gives us criminal charges against Karen and her accomplices, but these documents let us go after the real players behind the scenes. While our legal team worked, Linda had been coordinating with Susan Taylor, the local reporter. The story was growing beyond our local paper. Susan had contacted regional news outlets, and several were interested in covering the broader implications of developers using social manipulation to force property sales. This isn't just about a private road anymore, Susan explained during a phone call. It's about how development companies are using social media and planted agitators to undermine property rights. People need to know these tactics exist. Emily Cooper, our mediator friend, helped prepare me for media interviews. Stay focused on the facts, she advised. Don't let them turn this into a personal dispute between you and Karen. This is about protecting property rights and exposing corporate manipulation of communities. As we built our case, more evidence emerged. Steve Davis, who'd initially supported Karen's campaign, discovered that several residents actively posting in her Facebook group were actually fake accounts traced back to IP addresses at the development company's offices. Dave Chen, our software engineer neighbor, helped document the digital trail. The turning point came when Maria Ramirez found an old deed restriction in her husband's papers. The restriction, placed by original landowners in the 1940s, required any major road development in the area to undergo environmental impact studies due to underground water sources. The developers' plans had conveniently ignored this requirement. Jennifer was ecstatic when she saw the deed restriction. "This is perfect," she said, adding it to our growing file. "They can't claim they didn't know about it. It's in the county records. They were trying to bypass environmental regulations by stealing your private road instead of building a properly approved access route. Our legal strategy was coming together, but we knew the developers wouldn't go down without a fight. Through our network of contacts, we learned they were already preparing a counter-offensive, planning to paint me as an obstinate holdout preventing community progress. Catherine suggested we get ahead of their narrative. We need to show that this isn't about preventing development, it's about stopping corrupt development practices. Your road isn't just private property, it's become a symbol of standing up to corporate bullying. While the lawyers prepared our case, Linda and I focused on documenting every interaction with Karen and her associates. We installed additional security cameras, saved every email, and recorded every conversation. Karen's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic as she realized her position as the developer's agent was being exposed. The community continued to rally around us. Mike Anderson organized a neighborhood watch program to prevent further vandalism. Tom Henderson's engineering analysis of the developer's plans revealed several safety violations they'd tried to conceal. Even some Pine Grove residents who'd initially supported Karen were now providing statements about how they'd been misled. Jennifer called a strategy meeting to discuss our next move. "We're ready to file," she announced, showing us the completed lawsuit. "But before we do, I want to give them one chance to back down. Sometimes, just showing your hand is enough to force a settlement." She drafted a letter to the development company's board of directors, outlining our evidence and proposed legal action. The letter was a masterpiece of legal writing, professional yet threatening, detailed but clear. It laid out exactly what we knew about their scheme and what would happen if they didn't cease their activities immediately. "Send it," I said, reading the final draft. "They need to understand that we're not just fighting back, we're exposing their entire operation." As we waited for their response, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The quiet road my grandfather had built was about to become the centerpiece of a legal battle that could change how developers operate in communities across the region. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting your own property, it's about preventing others from becoming victims of the same tactics. The development company's response to our letter came swiftly and aggressively. Rather than backing down, they doubled their efforts to pressure us into submission. Early Monday morning, an expensive black SUV pulled into my driveway. Marcus Sterling, the development company's chief executive, stepped out along with their lead attorney, both wearing expressions that mixed condescension with barely concealed anger. "Mr. Mitchell," Sterling called out, straightening his designer tie, We should talk about resolving this situation amicably. Your letter makes some interesting claims. Perhaps we could discuss them over coffee?" I invited them inside, where Linda had already prepared coffee in our best cups, a subtle reminder that we weren't the unsophisticated opponents they'd expected. Jennifer Parker arrived moments later, right on schedule, her presence clearly catching them off guard. Sterling's attempted charm offensive lasted about 5 minutes before his true colors showed through. "Look, Mitchell," he snapped, dropping the friendly facade. "You're fighting a losing battle here. We have the resources to drag this out for years. How long can you afford to pay legal fees?" Jennifer smiled coolly. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, we should discuss the mounting evidence of your company's illegal practices. Those internal documents about community disruptors are particularly interesting. I wonder how your shareholders would react to that information." The company's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but Sterling pressed on. "Every development faces opposition from stubborn holdouts. We have ways of dealing with this. Your toll. Booth stunt? It's just delaying the inevitable." "Is that a threat?" I asked calmly, reaching for my phone. "Because I'm recording this conversation, and after the vandalism incident, any threats will be taken very seriously by law enforcement." Sterling's face reddened. "You're interfering with legitimate business operations. We'll bury you in lawsuits. We'll challenge every permit your grandfather ever filed. We'll make owning that road so expensive you'll beg us to take it off your hands." "Actually," Jennifer interjected, "your recent actions have made our case much stronger. Would you like to hear the latest recording from Mrs. Thompson? The one where she admits your company promised her a significant property discount in exchange for creating neighborhood discord?" The company's attorney grabbed Sterling's arm before he could respond. They excused themselves quickly, but their message was clear. This fight was far from over. They proved it that afternoon. Karen appeared at my toll booth with a team of workmen, claiming she had a township permit to repair the public right-of-way. Officer Brown arrived quickly at my call, preventing any alterations to my property, but it was just the beginning. Over the next few days, a series of coordinated attacks tested our resolve. First, anonymous complaints flooded the township office, alleging everything from unsafe road conditions to environmental violations. Mark Edwards, the city planner who'd supported us earlier, found himself buried in paperwork. Then came the legal barrage. The development company filed multiple lawsuits, challenging my property boundaries, questioning historical permits, and even attempting to claim adverse possession based on recent public use of the road. Jennifer had anticipated this and was ready with countermotions, but the message was clear. They were trying to drown us in legal fees. Karen's social media campaign reached new levels of absurdity. She began organizing daily protests at my toll booth, complete with signs claiming I was destroying property values and endangering children by forcing them to use dangerous public streets instead of my private road. The development company's strategy became clear. They were trying to overwhelm us on multiple fronts, hoping we'd give up from sheer exhaustion. What they hadn't counted on was the strength of our community response. Mike Anderson organized a counter-protest, with longtime residents sharing stories about the road's history and the developers' manipulation tactics. Susan Taylor's news coverage went viral, drawing attention from state-level media interested in investigating predatory development practices. Even the workmen who'd vandalized my toll booth turned against them. Facing criminal charges, they agreed to testify about how the development company had orchestrated the incident through Karen, promising to cover any legal consequences. Linda suggested we document everything happening in real time. Dave Chen helped set up a website where we could post updates, evidence, and community responses to each new attack. The developers' tactics, exposed to public scrutiny, began to look increasingly desperate. Then came their biggest mistake. Frustrated by our resistance, Sterling's company tried to force the issue by beginning construction on their Phase 2 project, claiming my road as a public right-of-way before any legal resolution. Jennifer immediately filed for an emergency injunction. The judge was not impressed by the development company's behavior. During the emergency hearing, Jennifer presented our evidence of their coordinated harassment campaign, including Sterling's recorded threats from our meeting. The judge not only granted our injunction, but also ordered a full investigation into the company's practices. Sterling's response was to send Karen on another offensive. She began following me and Linda around town, filming us and claiming she was documenting our harassment of the community. The police finally intervened when she tried to block Linda's car in a grocery store parking lot. The development company's aggressive tactics were backfiring spectacularly. Each new attack only strengthened our legal position and increased public support for our cause. Local business owners, concerned about the developers' practices, began publicly backing our fight. One evening, as Linda and I dealt with yet another false complaint filed by Karen, we received an unexpected call. A representative from the development company's major investor wanted to meet privately. The aggressive tactics had caught their attention, and not in a way Sterling had hoped. Throughout all this, my toll booth stood as a symbol of resistance. Despite the protests, vandalism attempts and legal challenges, it remained operational. Some neighbors even began paying the toll voluntarily, seeing it as a way to support our fight against corporate bullying. The development companies escalating. Attacks had transformed our private property dispute into something much larger. It wasn't just about a road anymore. It had become a battle over how development companies could treat communities and whether money and intimidation could override property rights. As pressure mounted from multiple directions, we could sense a turning point approaching. Sterling's aggressive strategy was beginning to crumble, but like a cornered animal, that made him more dangerous. We knew his next move would be dramatic. We just didn't know exactly what form it would take. The meeting with the development company's investor representative took place at a discreet restaurant in the next town over. Elizabeth Chen, a senior partner at the investment firm, was nothing like Sterling's bombastic persona. She listened intently as Jennifer and I laid out our evidence, occasionally taking notes in an elegant leather-bound notebook. "This is deeply concerning," she said finally, closing her notebook. "Our firm prides itself on ethical development. Your practices. What you're describing isn't just aggressive business, it's potentially criminal behavior." Sterling never disclosed any of this in his reports to us. Linda, who had insisted on attending, spoke up. "The toll booth wasn't about money, it was about protecting our property rights. But Sterling's response has exposed something much darker in how development companies can abuse their power." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "We've received similar complaints from other communities where Sterling's company operates. Your documentation could be the key to addressing a systemic problem. Would you be willing to share your evidence with our internal investigation team?" Before we could respond, our phones buzzed simultaneously. Mike Anderson was calling with urgent news. Sterling had made his move, and it was more audacious than we'd imagined. Under cover of darkness, his construction crew had begun paving a new access road that cut through the corner of my property, completely bypassing the toll booth. They were working fast, clearly hoping to create a fait accompli before we could stop them. Elizabeth's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "He did what?" She immediately pulled out her phone, stepping away to make calls. Jennifer was already contacting the police and the judge who had issued our injunction. Within an hour, the scene at my property had become chaos. Police cars with flashing lights surrounded the construction crew. Karen was there, with her ever-present phone, live streaming and claiming this was necessary community action. Sterling himself stood supervising, a smug smile on his face. Officer Brown approached Sterling with our injunction in hand. This construction is illegal. You're in violation of a court order and trespassing on private property. Shut it down now. Sterling waved a document of his own. We have an emergency construction permit signed by a township official. This is perfectly legal. Jennifer, who had arrived moments after the police, examined the permit. Her eyes narrowed. This signature, it's dated last week, but the official who supposedly signed it has been on medical leave for a month. The situation escalated quickly. More police arrived, including a detective specializing in fraud cases. The construction crew, realizing they might be involved in illegal activity, stopped work and began cooperating with authorities. Elizabeth Chen watched it all unfold with growing anger. "This ends tonight," she declared, pulling out her phone again. After a brief but intense conversation, she turned to Sterling. "The board has called an emergency meeting. Consider yourself suspended pending investigation." Sterling's facade finally cracked. "You can't do this. I built this company. Mitchell is just a stubborn old fool standing in the way of progress. Look around, all of this could have been avoided if he'd just sold his worthless road." His outburst was being recorded by multiple phones, including Karen's still-running live stream. She finally seemed to realize her position was crumbling, slowly lowering her phone as Sterling continued to rant. The detective stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, we need to discuss this fraudulent permit. Would you like to make a statement now, or shall we continue this conversation at the station?" As Sterling was led away, still protesting, Elizabeth turned to us. "Mr. Mitchell, I'd like to propose an alternative solution to this situation, one that respects your property rights while addressing legitimate community needs. Over the next few hours, as the police documented the scene and the construction equipment was removed, Elizabeth outlined a different vision. Her firm was willing to buy out Sterling's company and completely redesign the Phase 2 development. "Instead of stealing your road, we could work with you to create a limited access agreement that preserves your property rights while allowing emergency access. We'd also establish a trust to maintain the road's historic character and compensate you for any approved usage." Jennifer reviewed the preliminary proposal. "This could work, but we'd need solid legal frameworks to prevent future abuse. And what about the existing homeowners who were misled by Sterling's promises?" Elizabeth was already ahead of us. Full disclosure of all past practices, compensation for affected homeowners, and a community oversight board for future development. Decisions. We want to make this right. As discussions continued into the night, Karen finally approached our group. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous uncertainty. I need to tell you something. Sterling promised me a lot more than just a discounted house. There are documents, recordings. I kept everything." The detective perked, up with interest, and Jennifer quickly provided Karen with her card. "Let's talk tomorrow. It sounds like you might have evidence relevant to multiple investigations." Looking around at the scene, police documenting evidence, construction equipment pulling away, Sterling's abandoned SUV still parked haphazardly by my toll booth. Linda squeezed my hand. "Your grandfather would be proud," she whispered. "You didn't just protect his road, you exposed corruption that was hurting the entire community." Mike Anderson, who had been helping police photograph the illegal construction, joined us with a grin. "So, does this mean we can negotiate a neighborhood discount on those toll fees?" For the first time in weeks, genuine laughter broke out among our group. The crisis wasn't fully resolved, but the atmosphere had shifted decisively. Sterling's attempted power play had backfired spectacularly, bringing all his schemes crashing down in a single night. Elizabeth was already scheduling meetings with community representatives to discuss the path forward. Jennifer was coordinating with the detective about preserving evidence for multiple criminal investigations. And somewhere in a police station downtown, Sterling was learning a hard lesson about respecting property rights. The aftermath of Sterling's arrest sent shockwaves through Pine Grove community and beyond. Karen's promised evidence proved more explosive than anyone anticipated. She arrived at Jennifer's office the next morning with 3 thick folders and a USB drive containing recordings of every conversation she'd had with Sterling and his associates. The scope of the developer's manipulation went far deeper than we'd imagined. Karen had documented their entire playbook, from selecting disruptors to creating artificial crises in target neighborhoods. The USB drive contained recorded meetings where Sterling explicitly outlined how to pressure homeowners, manipulate property values, and bypass environmental regulations. "They approached me 6 months before I bought the house," Karen explained, her usual bravado replaced by quiet resignation. "They knew about my social media following and my history of neighborhood activism. Sterling said they needed someone who wasn't afraid to shake things up for the greater good of development." Detective Sarah Martinez spent hours going through Karen's materials. "This isn't just about fraudulent permits anymore," she explained during a briefing at the police station. "We're looking at systematic corruption, including bribing officials and falsifying environmental reports." Elizabeth Chen's investment firm moved swiftly to contain the damage. They announced a complete audit of all Sterling's development projects and established a victim compensation fund. The preliminary findings revealed similar schemes in 3 other communities, all following the same pattern of planted agitators and manufactured conflicts. Local media coverage exploded as more details emerged. Susan Taylor's initial story got picked up by national outlets, who saw it as a perfect example of corporate overreach and community resistance. Our quiet neighborhood became a symbol of standing up to predatory development practices. The Township Council called an emergency session to address the crisis. Robert Wilson, the council chairman, looked decidedly uncomfortable as evidence of overlooked warnings and rubber-stamped permits came to light. "We're implementing new oversight procedures immediately," he announced. "No development project will proceed without thorough community review and verified documentation." Jennifer was in her element, coordinating with multiple legal teams as the case expanded. "The criminal charges against Sterling are just the beginning," she explained during a community update meeting. "We're looking at civil suits, class actions, and regulatory violations. This could reshape how development companies operate in residential areas." Linda organized support for families who had been victimized by Sterling's schemes. Many Pine Grove residents had invested their life savings in homes only to discover they'd been manipulated into an artificial crisis. Through Elizabeth's firm, we established a community assistance program to help affected homeowners. Mike Anderson turned his attention to documenting the neighborhood's history. "We need to preserve the story of what happened here," he insisted. "Not just the conflict, but how the community came together to fight back. Future neighborhoods need to know what to watch for." The toll booth, which had started this whole confrontation, took on a new significance. Local artists approached me about turning it into a symbolic art installation, a monument to property rights and community resistance. We compromised by adding a small plaque telling the story of the road and the battle to protect it. Elizabeth's vision for reforming the development process gained traction. She brought in community planning experts to work with residents on a new approach to Phase 2. Instead of forcing changes through manipulation, they focused on genuine collaboration and respect for existing property rights. "We're looking at creating a community land trust," one expert explained during a planning session. "It would protect both private property rights and public interests, ensuring development serves the neighborhood rather than exploiting it." Karen's role in the community underwent a dramatic shift. After providing evidence against Sterling, she found herself in an unexpected position, helping other neighborhoods identify and resist similar development tactics. Her aggressive energy, once used to create conflict, was redirected toward community advocacy. The legal proceedings against Sterling and his associates moved forward steadily. Each new revelation seemed to uncover more layers of corruption. The fraudulent permit scheme alone implicated 3 township officials and 2 county inspectors. Sterling's attempt to steal my private road had inadvertently exposed a network of development fraud spanning multiple jurisdictions. Emily Cooper helped organize community healing sessions, recognizing that the conflict had left lasting tensions. "We need to acknowledge the harm done," she explained, "but also celebrate how we came together to protect our neighborhood's integrity." Through it all, my grandfather's road remained a symbol of resilience. The illegal construction Sterling had attempted was fully removed, and environmental specialists assessed any damage to the surrounding land. Elizabeth's firm covered the restoration costs, ensuring the road's historic character was preserved. Property values in the area, which Karen had claimed would be destroyed by my toll booth, actually increased as our story gained attention. Sarah Williams reported growing interest from buyers who appreciated a community that stood up for itself. "People want to live somewhere with strong community bonds and protected property rights," she explained. Dave Chen developed an app to help other neighborhoods document and resist predatory development tactics. "What happened here wasn't unique," he said during the app's launch meeting, "but our response can serve as a template for other communities facing similar pressures." The township's new Development Oversight Committee, formed in response to the scandal, established strict protocols for reviewing construction permits and community impact studies. Robert Wilson, eager to restore public trust, appointed several longtime residents to the committee, ensuring local interests would be properly represented. Detective Martinez's investigation expanded to include federal authorities as evidence of wire fraud and interstate corruption emerged. Sterling's attempt to force his way onto my private road had pulled a thread that was rapidly unraveling years of development industry misconduct. Late one evening, as Linda and I sat on our porch watching the sunset over my grandfather's road, Mike Anderson stopped by with an old photograph he'd found. It showed my grandfather standing proudly by the newly constructed road, his vision of a peaceful family sanctuary clearly visible in his smile. "He built this road to last," Mike said, handling the photograph carefully. "But I bet he never imagined it would end up protecting an entire community from corruption." Linda squeezed my hand as we looked at the photo. The road had become more than just a private driveway or a barrier against unwanted development. It was a reminder that sometimes standing firm on principle can reveal deeper truths and inspire others to fight for what's right. The federal investigation into Sterling's development practices reached a critical phase as autumn approached. FBI agents set up a temporary office in the township building, conducting interviews with dozens of residents who had experienced similar pressure tactics in other communities. The scope of corruption they uncovered was staggering. Special Agent Victoria Ramirez led the investigation, meticulously piecing together Sterling's network of influence. Her team discovered offshore accounts used to pay community disruptors. Like Karen, falsified environmental impact studies spanning 5 states, and evidence of systematic bribery reaching into multiple government agencies. Your private road dispute broke open something much bigger, Agent Ramirez explained during a briefing at Jennifer's office. Sterling's company wasn't just manipulating local communities. They were part of a larger network of developers using similar tactics across the country. Elizabeth Chen's investment firm continued their internal investigation, working closely with federal authorities. Their audit revealed that Sterling had hidden his illegal activities behind a maze of shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Each discovery brought new lawsuits and criminal charges. Karen's cooperation proved invaluable to prosecutors. Her detailed records included names, dates, and recordings of meetings where Sterling and his associates openly discussed their manipulation strategies. She had documented everything, perhaps sensing she might eventually need protection. They had it down to a science, Karen testified during a grand jury hearing. They would identify properties that blocked their development plans, then systematically work to isolate and pressure the owners. My role was to create enough neighborhood conflict that selling would seem like the easiest solution. The Township Council chambers were packed for a special hearing on development reform. Robert Wilson had invited urban planning experts, property rights advocates, and community leaders to help draft new regulations. The goal was to create a framework that would prevent future abuse while allowing responsible development. During the hearing, Professor Amanda Martinez from the State University's Urban Development Department presented research showing how Sterling's tactics had been refined over decades. This wasn't just about building houses, she explained. It was about using social pressure and manufactured crises to circumvent property rights and environmental protections. Linda organized a community history project, recording interviews with longtime residents about how the neighborhood had evolved. These testimonies revealed patterns of development pressure going back years, with Sterling's company repeatedly targeting historic properties and private roads that stood in their way. Mike Anderson's photos became part of a traveling exhibit about community resistance to corporate bullying. The images told a powerful story. From the first appearance of my toll booth to the night of Sterling's attempted illegal construction, documenting how one neighborhood had exposed and fought back against corruption. The criminal case against Sterling continued to expand. Prosecutors filed additional charges as new evidence emerged, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal environmental regulations. His attempt to steal my private road had opened a Pandora's box of criminal activity. Jennifer worked with other attorneys to establish a legal defense network for communities facing similar development pressure. They created resources to help homeowners recognize manipulation tactics and protect their property rights. The network quickly spread beyond our state, connecting with similar groups nationwide. Dave Chen's app gained national attention, featured in technology magazines as an innovative tool for community organizing. He added features allowing users to document and share evidence of development harassment, creating an early warning system for other neighborhoods. Emily Cooper conducted workshops teaching other communities how to build effective resistance to predatory development. The key is recognizing these tactics early, she explained. Once you understand their playbook, you can unite your neighborhood before they create divisions. Sarah Williams reported a significant shift in local real estate practices. Buyers began asking detailed questions about development plans and property rights protections. The scandal had created a more informed and vigilant community of homeowners. Elizabeth's firm implemented sweeping changes in their development approach. They established community advisory boards for all new projects, required transparent environmental impact studies, and created mechanisms for protecting historic properties and private rights. The township's new Development Oversight Committee became a model for other communities. They implemented strict verification procedures for construction permits, required detailed community impact studies, and established clear channels for resident input on all development decisions. Detective Martinez's local investigation expanded to include cold cases of suspicious property acquisitions. Several previously abandoned complaints were reopened, revealing connections to Sterling's operations. Each new discovery strengthened the prosecution's case. The toll booth itself became an unexpected tourist attraction. People would drive by to take photos, seeing it as a symbol of successful resistance to corporate overreach. Local artists proposed painting a mural on it, depicting the community's fight for justice. Robert Wilson approached me with an unusual request. The township wanted to document the entire case as a training tool for other municipalities. "Your stand didn't just protect your property," he said. "It created a blueprint for fighting corruption in development practices." Professor Martinez asked to include our story in her upcoming book about community resistance to corporate development pressure. She spent days interviewing residents, examining documents, and analyzing how one private road dispute had exposed systemic corruption. The federal investigation continued to uncover new layers of Sterling's operation. Agent Ramirez's team found evidence of similar schemes in dozens of communities, all following the same pattern of social manipulation and property rights violations. As autumn turned to winter, the first criminal trials began. Sterling's associates started turning on each other, offering testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Each new witness revealed more details about their systematic abuse of community trust. Linda and I received letters from homeowners across the country, sharing similar stories of development pressure and asking for advice. The toll booth had become more than a barrier. It was a beacon of hope for other communities facing similar battles. Jennifer coordinated with prosecutors to ensure all evidence was properly preserved and documented. The case was becoming a landmark study in how development companies could abuse their power and how communities could fight back effectively. Through it all, my grandfather's road remained unchanged. Its peaceful curve, a reminder of why the fight had been necessary. The property rights he had sought to protect had become a foundation for exposing and resisting corporate corruption in community development. Sterling's trial began on a cold winter morning, drawing media attention from across the country. The federal courthouse was packed with journalists, community activists, and residents from various neighborhoods affected by his development schemes. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare the full scope of his operation, painting a picture of systematic corruption that had evolved over decades. United States Attorney Rebecca Martinez presented a devastating timeline of Sterling's activities, backed by Karen's extensive documentation and testimony from former associates. The evidence showed how his company had refined their tactics, using social pressure and manufactured conflicts to force property sales in dozens of communities. Inside the courtroom, Sterling maintained his arrogant demeanor, but his confidence visibly wavered as former colleagues testified against him. His own executive assistant revealed how they had selected and trained community disruptors, teaching them sophisticated psychological tactics to create neighborhood discord. The financial evidence proved particularly damaging. Forensic accountants traced millions of dollars through offshore accounts used to pay off officials and fund their manipulation campaigns. Every transaction added years to Sterling's potential sentence, and his attorney's attempts to explain away the evidence grew increasingly desperate. Elizabeth Chen testified about how Sterling had concealed his activities from investors using elaborate financial structures to hide the true nature of his operations. Her testimony helped establish a pattern of deliberate fraud that extended far beyond simple development disputes. During cross-examination, Sterling's defense team tried to portray him as a passionate businessman whose methods, while aggressive, were standard industry practices. This strategy backfired when prosecutors produced internal memos showing he had explicitly instructed staff to hide their tactics from regulators and investors. Professor Martinez presented her research demonstrating how Sterling's company had targeted historically significant properties and private roads that posed obstacles to their developments. Her analysis revealed a calculated pattern of undermining property rights through social manipulation and false claims. The prosecution's most powerful evidence came from the residents themselves. One by one, homeowners from different communities took the stand, describing how Sterling's tactics had torn apart their neighborhoods. Their testimonies painted a picture of systematic exploitation that transcended simple business disputes. Linda testified about the toll the conflict had taken on our community, describing how Sterling's orchestrated pressure campaign had affected longtime residents. Her quiet dignity on the stand contrasted sharply with Sterling's increasingly agitated behavior as the evidence mounted against him. Jennifer's meticulous documentation of our case proved crucial in establishing Sterling's methods. The security, camera footage, social media posts, and recorded threats created a clear timeline of escalating harassment leading to criminal acts. Each piece of evidence reinforced the prosecution's narrative of calculated corruption. Karen's testimony proved particularly compelling. She spent 2 days on the stand, detailing how Sterling had recruited and trained her to create chaos in our neighborhood. Her inside perspective revealed the sophisticated psychology behind their manipulation tactics, designed to exploit community tensions for profit. The defense attempted to discredit Karen by highlighting her role in the scheme, but this strategy backfired when she produced recorded conversations showing how Sterling had specifically chosen her for her aggressive personality and social media influence. Her candid admission of her own culpability only made her testimony more credible. Agent Ramirez presented evidence linking Sterling's operations to similar schemes across multiple states. The pattern was always the same: identify strategic properties, plant agitators in the community, create artificial crises, then swoop in to solve the problems they had manufactured. Township officials testified about how Sterling had systematically corrupted local government processes. Their testimony revealed a network of paid informants, bribed officials, and fraudulent permits that had enabled his company to bypass environmental regulations and property rights protections. As the trial progressed, more developers came forward with information about similar tactics in their industry. Sterling's case had exposed practices that had become almost standard in certain development circles, prompting calls for nationwide reform of development regulations. The environmental impact of Sterling's schemes became a major focus of the prosecution. Expert witnesses detailed how his company had repeatedly falsified environmental studies, concealing potential hazards to expedite their projects. Each revelation added new charges to his growing list of offenses. Mike Anderson's photographic documentation of our neighborhood's resistance became key evidence, showing the progression from peaceful community to battleground and back. His images captured the physical manifestation of Sterling's tactics and their impact on everyday lives. The defense's case crumbled as more of Sterling's former employees testified about their roles in the scheme. Project managers, accountants, and even his personal assistant described a corporate culture built around exploiting and manipulating communities for profit. Elizabeth's investment firm presented their internal audit findings, demonstrating how Sterling had hidden his illegal activities behind legitimate business operations. Their evidence showed a sophisticated system of financial manipulation designed to deceive both investors and regulators. Throughout the trial, our community's story remained central to the prosecution's case. The fight over my grandfather's road had exposed not just one developer's crimes, but an entire system of corporate manipulation that had evolved to circumvent property rights and community interests. The jury seemed particularly moved by testimony about how Sterling's tactics had affected elderly residents, forcing some to sell homes they had lived in for decades. These personal stories transformed the trial from a simple fraud case into a referendum on corporate ethics and community rights. As the prosecution neared the end of their case, Sterling's composure finally broke. In a moment of frustration, he burst out with a tirade about backwards-thinking residents standing in the way of progress, inadvertently confirming the prosecution's portrayal of his contempt for property rights. The right to protect one's property, a principle my grandfather had understood so well, had become the cornerstone of a case that would reshape how development companies operated across the nation. Each day of testimony reinforced the importance of standing firm against corporate bullying, no matter how overwhelming the pressure might seem. The jury reached their verdict after just 6 hours of deliberation. As the forewoman stood to read the decision, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Sterling was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, environmental violations, and dozens of other charges. His face remained emotionless as the judge announced a sentence that would effectively ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. Elizabeth Chen's investment firm immediately announced comprehensive reforms in their development practices. They established a $100 million fund to compensate communities affected by Sterling's schemes and created new oversight mechanisms to prevent similar abuses. Their actions set a new standard for corporate responsibility in property development. The impact of the case rippled through the development industry nationwide. The Department of Justice launched investigations into similar practices at other companies. Professional associations revised their ethical guidelines, and state legislatures began drafting new laws to protect property rights against corporate manipulation. Karen's cooperation with prosecutors earned her a reduced sentence, community service and probation instead of jail time. She channeled her energy into working with Emily Cooper, helping other communities recognize and resist development pressure tactics. Together, they created educational programs that empowered homeowners to protect their rights. Back in our neighborhood, the changes were profound. The Pine Grove community development continued under new management, with Elizabeth's firm taking a radically different approach. They worked closely with residents to create a plan that respected existing property rights while allowing for sustainable growth. My private road remained private, but we established clear guidelines for emergency access and community use. Dave Chen's Community Protection app became standard software for neighborhood associations across the country. It helped countless communities document and resist similar pressure tactics, creating an early warning system that made it harder for developers to isolate and target individual homeowners. The toll booth remained as a symbol, but its purpose had evolved. Instead of collecting fees, it now housed a small museum documenting our community's fight for justice. Local schools brought students to learn about property rights and the importance of standing up to corporate bullying. The story of one family's determination to protect their heritage had become a lesson in civic engagement. Jennifer's legal defense network expanded nationally, providing resources and support to communities facing development pressure. She regularly testified before state legislatures, helping craft new laws to prevent the kinds of abuses Sterling had perfected. Her work ensured that our experience would help protect other neighborhoods from similar threats. Professor Martinez's book about our case became required reading in urban planning programs. She used our story to illustrate the delicate balance between development and community rights, showing how corporate power could be checked by informed and united residents. The book's success led to a documentary series examining similar conflicts across the country. Linda's Community History Project grew into a permanent archive, preserving not just the story of our fight, but the broader history of how neighborhoods can resist corporate pressure while maintaining their character and unity. The archive became a resource for researchers studying community organizing and property rights protection. Mike Anderson's photographs were featured in a Smithsonian exhibition about community resistance movements. His images captured both the conflict and the triumph, showing how ordinary people could stand up to powerful interests and win. The exhibition traveled nationwide, inspiring other communities to protect their rights. The township's new development oversight committee became a model for local governments nationwide. Their transparent processes and strong community involvement requirements helped prevent the kinds of abuses Sterling had exploited. Robert Wilson frequently consulted with other municipalities implementing similar reforms. Sarah Williams reported that property values in our area had stabilized at record highs. The community's successful resistance to corporate pressure had created a reputation for strong neighborhood cohesion and protected property rights. New residents were drawn to the area specifically because of its demonstrated commitment to preserving community character. My grandfather's road, the catalyst for all these changes, remained much as he had built it decades ago. The trees he planted still lined its curves, their branches creating patterns of light and shadow on the pavement. But now it represented something bigger than just a private driveway. It had become a symbol of how ordinary citizens could stand up to corporate power and win. On warm evenings, Linda and I often sit on our porch, watching the sunset paint, the sky over the road. Sometimes neighbors stop by to chat, sharing stories about their own experiences during the conflict. The sense of community that emerged from our struggle has only grown stronger with time. The final chapter of Sterling's story came when federal investigators used evidence from our case to expose similar schemes across the country. His conviction became a watershed moment in the fight against predatory development practices, leading to nationwide reforms in how corporations interact with communities. Emily Cooper's mediation skills proved invaluable in helping our neighborhood heal from the conflict. She worked with residents from both sides of the dispute, helping rebuild trust and establish new ways of resolving community issues. Her methods became a blueprint for other neighborhoods recovering from similar battles. Our story continues to inspire others facing similar challenges. The lesson wasn't just about protecting property rights. It was about the power of community unity in the face of corporate pressure. Sometimes the most important victories come not from defeating an opponent, but from showing others that resistance is possible. My grandfather's vision of a peaceful family sanctuary had evolved into something he could never have imagined, a symbol of community resistance and triumph over corporate greed. The road he built with such care now stands as a testament to the enduring power of individual rights and community action. As new generations grow up in our neighborhood, they learn the story of how one private road and a determined community changed the way America thinks about development and property rights. It's a reminder that sometimes the most significant changes start with a simple stand for what's right. The battle over my grandfather's road became more than just a property dispute. It evolved into a movement that continues to inspire and protect communities across the nation. In the end, Karen's insistence that my private road was public property led to something far more valuable than any toll fees could measure. It helped create a blueprint for how communities can protect themselves against corporate overreach, while preserving their character and unity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.